8 and 9, we talked about serious problems with the Quentyn quest. The main, unshakable question being, with all his resources, why didn't Doran do more? Why didn't Doran do more for his supposed 17-year carefully planned mission to bring back Targaryens and dragons? This is especially striking as we discussed in part 10, the Martells clearly had extensive knowledge about dragons and provided Quentyn with nothing. Doran even has a copy of Septon Barth's Unnatural History, apparently not destroyed during the reign of Baelor, which makes sense since Dorne wasn't part of the Seven Kingdoms yet. On top of this book, Oberyn had been lurking in places of knowledge, like the Citadel and behind the walls of Volantis. And Sorella Sand has been trailing Marwyn, a man who has been searching for the content of dragon dreams in the mind of Aemon, and whose crony, Quhuru Mo, saw Dany and Karth, and whose student, Mirri Duur, was at Dany's egg hatching. But let's talk about Mirri Duur for a moment. Dany runs into Mirri when Khal Drogo is raiding east in a Game of Thrones. For some reason, a Lázarine village had established itself on what Drogo thinks are Dothraki lands. In fact, not just one, but two Khalasars are sacking this easy target. So it's a bit odd that these Lázarine had stupidly made themselves such low-hanging fruit for the Dothraki. Now what's quite striking is that when Dany first meets Mirri, she thanks Dany in the common tongue. Let's keep in mind that Dany is commanding her men in Dothraki, and girls that look like Dany generally come from Lyce, and for cross-cultural communication, High Valyrian is normally used, which is what Dany used in the markets. There is no reason for Mirri to use the common tongue here, unless she knew exactly who Dany was. Now Mirri tells Dany that she learned the common tongue from Marwyn and Ashai, so the two must have spent many months, maybe years together. But it gets even odder. Mirri says that she met Marwyn when she was young, and says Marwyn came from the land where dragons ruled. This points to the fact that Mirri and Marwyn spent time together before Robert's Rebellion. For some reason, Mirri had been keeping up on her common tongue since her training 16 years earlier. Now, beyond the language, Mirri Duur seems a bit overqualified for the position of Podunk village healer. Mirri studied with mages of Ashai, moonsingers of Jogus Nye, Dothraki magicians, a blood mage who knew about shadow binding, and of course, a maester of the Citadel. Perhaps most significantly, she holds the title of Maegi. We will return to that point. Now yes, coincidences tend to happen in stories, but it's astoundingly odd that Dany, a common tongue speaker who happens to own dragon eggs, runs into a massively learned common tongue speaking Maegi who studied with a man who's obsessed with dragons. It seems likely that Mirri was waiting for Dany. Now, a lot of weird stuff happens to Dany after meeting Mirri, and an entire video series could be done on this period of Dany's adventure. Did Mirri really poison Drogo, or did Drogo die because he didn't follow her advice? Or did he simply die because people die all of the time? Did Mirri kill Rhaego, or did Jorah's meddling do that? Or did Dany just happen to miscarry because women miscarry all of the time? Is Rhaego even dead or simply spirited off because we definitely didn't see a body? And did Mirri hatch the dragons or did Dany? Did Mirri protect Dany from fire or did Dany do it to herself? How did Quaithe visiting Dany with her glass candle affect things? And how much can Dany's point of view even be trusted? It's all hard to say. However, I will say this. Mirri studied with a blood mage, and Mirri Duur holds the title of Maegi. She later tells us what Maegi means. It means wise. Of course, we know of other people with titles quite similar to wise. The alchemists, pyromancers who deal with the science of fire. All members of their order hold the title of wisdom. And we know that there are alchemists in Ashai. If Mirri is also an alchemist, then she studied both blood magic and fire magic, what Marwyn tells us are the root of all Valyrian sorcery. Now, I'm not certain if alchemists actually know anything about waking dragons, but the Targaryens certainly thought they did. The alchemists and their wildfire were close to Aerion Brightflame when he died. They were with Egg at Summerhall when he died, and with the Mad King Aerys when he died, all in apparent attempts to wake dragons. So it's again astoundingly coincidental that Mirri Duur, who has an alchemist's title, is near Dany at the birthing of dragons. It seems almost certain that Mirri Duur was not in the Dothraki Sea by accident. What exactly she was doing is a mystery. Perhaps she was there to hatch the eggs. Perhaps she was there to steal the eggs. Perhaps she was there to stop Dany. We simply don't know. That said, Marwyn seems to want dragons in the world, which is an odd position considering that these are weapons of mass destruction. And after Marwyn's student ran into Dany, dragons were back in the world. Of course, Mirri Duur is not the only associate of Marwyn that Dany runs into in the east. In Qarth, Dany runs into Quhuru Mo, the captain of the Cinnamon Wind. Now, Quhuru Mo is again suspicious. Like Mirri Duur, he seems to know exactly who Dany is, as he calls her Stormborn. Let's keep in mind that Daenerys is not a super famous character at this point. Later on, the Acolytes of the Citadel barely know who she is, and neither do sailors who Davos speaks to in A Dance with Dragons. Quhuru, though, knows exactly who she is and what she wants. He knows she wants the Iron Throne and would be happy with news of King Robert's death. Let's also keep in mind, at this point of our story, Dany hasn't even visited the Pureborn of Qarth to ask for assistance or reveal her intentions. Now, Quhuru Mo is a crony of Marwyn, and similar to Marwyn, Quhuru is happy to have dragons back in the world. Ecstatic, really. Again, this is a very odd position. Dragons are weapons of mass destruction. A random traitor has no reason to smile over this. It seems likely that Quhuru Mo's opinion is influenced by Marwyn's opinion, and that Quhuru Mo found out about Dany from Marwyn. In fact, it seems likely that Quhuru Mo is in Qarth on Marwyn's orders. Now, I will say that Quhuru Mo is a bit of a liar. Quhuru comes to Dany with news of Robert's death, but also with news of Ned's arrest and Renly and Stannis' rebellions, which he claims he heard of in Old Town. But Quhuru also says that he stops in Dorne and finds similar news there. Now that's weird. Had Quhuru stopped in Dorne, say a few weeks after Old Town, the main gossip of the kingdom should have been that there's fighting in the Riverlands, or at least the calling of banners for the coming Stark-Lannister war. It seems Quhuru was not being completely honest about where he got his information from and his previous route. On top of this, Quhuru's supposed future itinerary also seems dishonest. Quhuru Mo claims that he's heading east, but that's highly unlikely. Dany asks, "When does your ship return to Westeros, Captain?" And Quhuru responds, "Not for a year or more, I fear. From here the Cinnamon Wind sails east to make the traitor's circle round the Jade Sea." Now there's some ambiguity here. Does Quhuru mean he begins his journey for Westeros in a year, or does he arrive in Westeros in a year? Dany is clearly asking for a ride, so she wants to know when Quhuru is leaving. So let's say that Quhuru means that the traitor's circle in the Jade Sea will take a year, and he begins his journey for Westeros then from Qarth. This interpretation would make the most sense for denying Dany passage, except we know that this is untrue as we run into the Cinnamon Wind in Braavos about a year later in Samwell 3: A Feast for Crows. The ship should still be in the Jade Sea or near Qarth at this point. Okay, now let's examine the other interpretation, that what Quhuru means is that he will arrive in Westeros in a year or more. Okay, well this means that in order to get around the Jade Sea, back to Qarth, over to the Narrow Sea, and up to Braavos in about a year, Quhuru's trip around the Jade Sea must have only taken a few months. That means he would actually be back in Qarth relatively soon. In fact, Dany actually stays in Qarth for several months after talking to Quhuru Mo, long enough for Illyrio and Pentos to hear about Dany in Qarth and send Barristan all the way there. In this case, Quhuru could have completely given Dany a ride. Of course, Quhuru Mo being a shady liar is not an isolated incident. Later on, Sam and Aemon come to the Cinnamon Wind to speak of dragons, but they only get to talk to Zondo. Zondo never saw any dragons. It was Quhuru who was the man who saw the dragons and met Daenerys, but he feigns not being able to communicate with Sam and Aemon. That's right, he feigns it. We know Quhuru Mo speaks High Valyrian, which Sam speaks as well, albeit badly. But more importantly, Aemon almost certainly speaks High Valyrian. After all, he had a Targaryen education and is a maester. Quhuru spent months on a ship with Sam and Aemon and never revealed that he could communicate with them. Of course, it's still a mystery why Quhuru didn't want to talk to Sam and Aemon about dragons or anything for that matter. Perhaps Quhuru thought too much communication would lead to them figuring out he was up to something nefarious. It's hard to say. One other huge mystery is, if Marwyn and the Cinnamon Wind were interested in Dany and her dragons, why leave them in Qarth? Quhuru had the opportunity to give Dany a ride, but passed it up. Why? Why even be in Qarth? Perhaps Quhuru was actually Mirri Duur's ride and was thrown off by her absence, or perhaps he was merely gathering information, though a glass candle could do that without the cinnamon wind sailing halfway around the world. One thing that Quhuru did do with his news was help motivate Dany to head west rather than east. Prior to making it to Qarth, Jorah actually wanted to head east to Asshai, but news of Robert's death makes Dany believe that the Seven Kingdoms are ripe for the taking. So Quhuru Mo is a man who is happy about dragons being back in the world, and pushes Dany into bringing those dragons westward towards Westeros. Though weirdly, he did not want to be the one personally to take her. He instead allowed Illyrio's cronies Barristan, Belwas, and Groleo to collect Dany. Now, of course, by dealing with Dany, Marwyn, Mirri, and Quhuru are interfering with Illyrio's plans. And as we talked about in Part 9, we saw the inverse. Illyrio's cronies seem to have been interfering with Doran's Quentyn quest. It does all make it appear as if there's a Dornish-Illyrio rivalry that perhaps parallels the Rhoynar-Valyrian rivalry of old. But speaking of possible Dornish effects on Illyrio's plans, I'd like to switch gears and talk about the pole boat that takes Aegon and Jon Connington down the mighty Rhoyne. It is called the Shy Maid and is captained by Yandri and Ysilla. Although you may not have realized it, these two are actually Dornish orphans of the Greenblood. And as we talked about in Part 1, the orphans are some of Doran's greatest allies. Now let's keep in mind that Yandri and Ysilla are so staunch in their Rhoynar ways that they moved back to Essos. And yet for some reason they're helping a Valyrian restoration plan organized by a slaver that involves dragons and putting a sexist Aegon on the throne. That's certainly not a very Rhoynish thing to do, especially for two so intimately familiar with Crowayne. Now Yandri and Ysilla are rather forgettable background characters. Perhaps they're nobodies, perhaps they're merely spies. But there is one way in which they influence the events of A Dance with Dragons. In Tyrion 6, the Shy Maid is docked in Selhorys. Yandri returns to tell Jon Connington that the news in the market says that Volantis is going to war against Daenerys. Tyrion and Haldon are then sent into town to confirm this news. As it turns out, Yandri's tale is extremely misleading. You see, there's an election coming up in Volantis, and it has 3 triarchs. They are currently Danaphos, an unpopular elephant who apparently wants peace, Essos, a pro-war elephant who is bought by Illyrio and Yunkai, and Malakwo, a pro-war tiger. Now Malakwo wants war for glory, but we don't know on which side he wants to be on Yunkai's side or on Dany's. He seems to be in a precarious situation as half of the tiger military are R'hllor worshippers who want to side with Dany, and Benero, the priest of the Red Temple in Volantis, has been speaking against him. So in truth, only Essos wants to go to war against Dany, and Volantis' actions are completely dependent upon their upcoming election. It looks like Volantis is going to war, but we don't know on which side. It's all dependent on which triarchs will be replaced and who replaces them. All signs point to the Tigers taking power, but will the Tigers be pro-Dany or anti-Dany? And will their slave soldier tiger cloaks follow them? Essentially, the followers of R'hllor are the vitally important players here, which Tyrion and Haldon discover almost immediately after entering Selhorys. Really, Jon Connington and the Golden Company should have waited for the Volantene election to observe the effects of the Tiger takeover, but instead he and the Golden Company head west. Jon Con wrongly believes that the East was closed to them, and the followers of R'hllor are not even mentioned at all by the Golden Company when assessing the political environment. Now, I'm not saying that Yandri was the sole influencing voice that caused the Golden Company to head west. Tyrion's bad advice to Aegon certainly played a role, and Harry Strickland did have bad information as well, and Jon Con was losing trust in Haldon Halfmaester, who likely had a more nuanced tale from Selhorys. Still, I do wonder why Yandri's tale from the market was so off, and I do wonder if Jon Con's confidence in a Dornish alliance, another reason for marching west, is somewhat colored by his time with Yandri and Ysilla. Now, Illyrio's plan to merge the forces of Dany and Aegon were not just foiled by the Golden Company heading west, but also by Dany getting stuck in Slaver's Bay. And this is largely the fault of a part Dornish character named Brown Ben Plumm. Now, we don't have too much strong evidence that Brown Ben is working for the Dornish, but Brown Ben Plumm is of course the commander of the Second Sons, Oberyn's old sellsword company. And he also has a weird fascination and connection with dragons. Brown Ben Plumm, though, does often appear as a balance to the Windblown, who, as discussed in Part 9, may have connections to Illyrio. There is an interesting moment in A Dance with Dragons where Brown Ben is pitted against Zahrina in an auction, bidding on Tyrion. Zahrina, as we discussed in Part 9, is an ally of the Windblown and wears the golden skulls of the Golden Company. And later on, both Brown Ben and the Tattered Prince are invited to Yezin's tent, and during the Battle of Fire, Brown Ben is very interested in the actions of the Windblown. If Brown Ben Plumm were on the side of the Dornish, we would again have a Dornish-Illyrio rivalry situation. Now, Brown Ben Plumm's largest influence on our story and the plans of Illyrio happen with the taking of Meereen. Dany marches to Meereen and finds its walls a daunting obstacle. Jorah urges Dany to keep marching, but Brown Ben Plumm introduces the idea of using the sewers. Brown Ben refuses to go on this mission, and so Jorah, Barristan, and Belwas, all three of Illyrio's men, are sent on this dangerous mission through the sewers in order to take the city. And Dany's ships are destroyed to be turned into battering rams. Let's keep in mind that Dany stopping in Meereen and smashing the slave trade are the primary reasons that Aegon never meets up with Dany. And this is all facilitated by Brown Ben Plumm's plan. So generally, over in Essos, Dorne and Marwyn's possible cronies seem to be lurking around Dany and screwing up the plans of Illyrio. Mirri Maz-Duur was at the birthing of dragons and may have even killed Drogo, causing the Khalasar to dissolve. Brown Ben Plumm kept Dany in Meereen, while Yandri told Jon Connington that he couldn't head east. But what does it all mean? Is Doran just trying to screw up Illyrio's plans, or does he actually have an endgame with dragons? After all, Dorne and Marwyn have definitely been researching dragons, and yet Quhuru Mo passed up giving Dany a ride. Why be happy about dragons being in the world if you're not in control of them? Well, we'll talk about that and wrap up the Deeper Dorne in Part 12, coming in a few days.